Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Voices from the Mausoleum. And we're back with another episode of Spooky Sunday Stories. In the previous episode of Spooky Sunday Stories, I read a short by Jennifer Bernardini and mentioned her anthology that she put together with a bunch of writers called Something Bad Happened, an anthology of horror. And I said I was going to read a story from this, and that's what we're doing today in today's episode. So Something Bad Happened, an anthology of horror. I'll put Jen's socials in the description for this episode again, as well as where you can find this book. It's on Amazon. It's available in all formats. And I'm also going to put a list of horror authors. They're all indie authors, all fantastic writers. I will put the list of the others in the description for this episode as well. So this was a cool concept. So originally when she put out this anthology, there was essentially like a journal of choice that had journal topics. And then each topic is essentially like a prompt to base your story off of. So you would pick, whatever prompt you wanted to pick, you'd write your story and then you'd submit it. And that's how this one was done. Anyway, that's what we're doing in this episode. And I didn't think to have this open before I started recording. That's okay. I don't think I'm far set. There it is. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to be reading a story from this. And the story I'm going to be reading today is called, here's a picture for it. It's called Soul Eater. And it's written by me. So the prompt that I chose for my submission for this anthology was the I don't understand. I kind of tweaked it a little bit, and instead I made it I'll never understand. And so we're going to jump into to my story of Soul Eater in Something Bad Happened, an anthology of horror. Okay. I'm so professional. But speaking of, I'm just going to drink something really quick. My throat's like super dry today. All right. Soul Eater by Angel from, Voices from the Mausoleum. I'll never understand. That was the first thought that went through Father Cameron Monroe's head as he stared at the girls' mother and father sitting awkwardly at their dining room table. Whatever it costs, we'll do it. Please, you have to help our daughter. If I had a nickel, was what Father Monroe thought as he stood before the trembling father and horrified mother. Their daughter, Cameron thought, looking at the wooden door that was nailed shut from the outside. He shook his head in contemplation. Could this one be real? It didn't seem likely, given everything he had seen in his decade as a priest. This felt drastic, though, even for Christians. By that point, Father Monroe had seen and experienced it all. He had even been possessed during a routine exorcism. Routine. That wasn't really a word meant to be used in such a context. From that day forward, Cameron never underestimated God's willingness to let someone suffer. It was the first time he had ever known doubt as a priest. Tell me again, Father Monroe's voice was even but firm. What happened before these odd occurrences? Mr. Mayor nodded, his face showing clear signs of defeat, from the stress lines around his mouth and cheeks to the dark pillows beneath his worn eyes. There was a time, the priest guessed, when the man's cloudy gaze had once been blue instead of gray, a time, perhaps, when the pain didn't exist. Cameron wasn't a true monster. He hated seeing humans suffer. He hated knowing they worshiped something that didn't give a flying fuck about them. Father Monroe seethed as he tried to relax and took a seat at the worn table. Mr. Mayor explained he didn't think his daughter had done anything to invite a spirit in, answering a question that most men in his field would have thought to ask. It had taken a great deal of effort to get Mr. Mayor to calm down enough to tell Father Monroe what was going on. He had already had several conversations with the parents. Understanding the family's plight, it still made it difficult for the priest to get through the questions. What he knew was that they didn't believe their daughter was into any sort of devil worship. She had gone to the docks with a few friends, and when she came back that night, it was like the lights in her mind were on, but no one was home. We couldn't keep her attention. She'd stare at us without blinking for way too long. At first, she wouldn't even speak to us. She was alive and in front of us, but she wasn't our daughter. Father Monroe furrowed his brows. Nothing this man said gave him any inclination into what could have actually happened. Their daughter could have come back different for any number of reasons. However, when Father Monroe tried to ask the hard questions, Mr. Mayor wasn't having it. Does your daughter have a boyfriend? Is it possible something else could have happened? Mr. Mayor's hands had flown up as if the motion of doing so could have physically prevented Cameron from saying anything further. Absolutely not. We know our daughter. This is demonic. This is something else. Now, sitting with them, Father Monroe recounted the events and sighed heavily. Still, the nails? I assume she grew violent? The mother nodded, but as soon as she opened her mouth, she sobbed uncontrollably. Her frail arms lifted ever so slightly so her hands could hide her emotions from the almost stranger across from her. We woke up the other morning round 3, and she was sitting on my wife's chest with a knife to her throat. As if on cue, Miss Mayor's hands rose to her throat. Mr. Mayor looked down at the ground, his eyes brimming with all the pain he felt for his daughter. It was too early to tell if this was an act or not. Father Monroe sighed. 3 in the morning. Of course it was 3. This mocking of the Trinity was proof enough of how childish and yet predictable unclean spirits could be. I've heard enough, Mr. Mayor. Can you get me a tool to remove the nails? I'm going to go in and meet your daughter. Mr. Mayor, or Jacob, as Father Monroe recalled, looked surprised. Waiting for him to move, the priest shifted a bit. What is her first name? Mr. Mayor finally snapped out of his hesitating stupor. Her name is Katie. Nodding, Cameron pulled his rosary from inside his garments and wrapped it around his wrist and his middle finger. Grabbing his book and the small vial of blessed water he brought inside with him, he tried to center his focus. There was still the genuine possibility that he was going into that room to find a broken, neglected child. Over the years of performing these so-called exorcisms, he had seen just how depraved these people could be. These followers of a greater good, these men and women of justice and love. What a bunch of bullshit. Conveniently, the hammer had been resting on a counter in the kitchen. Items placed in an accessible spot were a sign of a staged event. The bitterness of his own history with Christians and exorcisms clouded his judgment. He had to remain unbiased until he obtained proof. Cameron took the hammer from Mr. Mayor and carefully approached the door. When he touched the outside, it felt hot, something he hadn't expected, but he pulled the large nails from the door despite the unease settling beneath his skin. Taking a deep breath, he pulled the final nail and the weight of the door shifted. For a moment, Father Cameron wondered if the door was going to fall over on him. He rolled his shoulders back and took his first step into the room. The first thing he noticed was it was dark and cold, the sort of cold that made your lungs tighten as though there were no oxygen to take in. There was very little to see just yet, but it surprised him how empty the room felt. There was nothing inviting about it or warm. As he moved into the room, it was as though all the sound had completely vanished. There was a faint ringing in his ears from the silence. Father Monroe remained still for just a moment as he existed in the void. Fuck. All at once, the smell of rot wrapped around his sense of smell like a molded blanket, dense and suffocating. Father Monroe's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and in the far right corner of the room, he saw slight movement, just enough to tell him it was the girl. She faced the corner. Her knees appeared to be up in her chest. Are you here to help me? She sounded like she had been crying, but her voice shifted at the end of her question. It was as if her throat needed to be cleared. Kids were a hard thing for Cameron. Taking this path with his life, he didn't have any of his own. How can they worship something that would do this? A question he often wondered. His jaw grew taut as he thought about the answer so many people gave. God's will. Or his favorite, everything happens for a reason. Yes, because it was simple to justify an almighty being's cruelty by saying he did it because he wanted to. There was a sour taste in his mouth, and he thought he might vomit from the bitterness. Now was not the time to do his usual back and forth with himself. I am. Katie, can you tell me if you're hurt? He cautiously moved closer. The lights in the room flickered on and off for a moment before finally deciding to stay on. Glancing around the small space, he tried to get a lay of the land. The floor, though neat, was littered with dark stains. Not wanting to assume it was anything other than normal wear and tear that came with having a child, he turned his attention to the walls. Immediately, he noticed the markings above her headboard. Deeply rooted scratches had all but shredded the faded yellow wallpaper. Her bedding looked as though it had been washed with mud. The conditions were less than desirable, and it was hard to shake that this might just be another abuse case. The sound had not yet returned to the room. Silence remained a moment longer before he heard the fast approaching steps of the girl he had taken his eyes off of for too long. Before he reacted, Katie launched herself into him, knocking him to the ground. His book dropped to the floor as he clung to the small bottle he held. Help me, the girl cried out, slashing at Father Monroe's face. It wasn't until her fingers connected to the side of his cheek that he realized she didn't have any nails left. Bloody fingertips smacked against his flesh. Cameron tried to grab her arms to keep her from touching him, but it was taking him a moment to get his head back in the game. Peering up at the girl, all that remained before him was her shell. Her eyes were sunken in, cheekbones protruding. Her skin sagged, loosely hanging on by a thread to the skeleton inside her form. The reality hit him then. She looked as though she could not last much longer. She was strong for her clearly weakened state. Grabbing her wrist to keep her fingers away from his face and neck, he tried to control her thrashing. Katie, if you can hear me, I need you to tell me you're there. Show me you're there. All at once, the sound returned. As the noises of their scuffle quieted, Katie yelled down at him. Her body was still slightly on top of his as Father Monroe was pushing her back enough to sit upright. Listen to me. Katie, you have to. His words were abruptly cut short when her neck violently twitched from side to side for a moment. Her eyes darkened and her mouth fell open, and suddenly he knew where the smell of decay was coming from. No, no, no. The girl's voice was getting deeper and deeper. Time to pay your fee, Father. As her head fell forward, he watched as the girl's hands reached out for his throat. He rolled with the girl on top of him, discarding the bottle. He pinned her to the floor with his left hand while moving the right hand upward. He lowered his rosary to the girl's cheek. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Father Monroe began the rite of exorcism. Father Monroe's first brush with possession was a young child. The boy's name was Thomas. They had Thomas tied with a chain to a post in the middle of an abandoned silo. Their house was a good 3 miles away, and they had left the boy there to rot. As Cameron happened upon Thomas, he was already prepared to call child services. In those days, he had never experienced a true demonic takeover of a human body. Instead, most were mental illness or total lies. The reason for their lies varied case to case, but generally it was for attention or popularity. You see enough movies, and suddenly you want to be in one. Thomas was different. That night, as Father Monroe cut away the chains, he learned what real evil looked like. Only one person left that silo alive. Thomas had broken Cameron's collarbone, 3 ribs, his nose, and had cut the Achilles tendon in the priest's right ankle. Thomas's parents seemed relieved their son was dead. It was hard to say one way or the other what they might actually be feeling. There was a lingering moment for Cameron as he realized that their hatred for their child could have been what opened him up for the devil to play with. A notion that sat in the back of his mind. What did the parents do to make Katie so vulnerable to evil? What was her life like before the change? Was her father to blame? And if so, did her mother know? The girl's body contorted as she tried to move away from him. The thoughts of Thomas drifted back in the shadows of Cameron's mind. You need a penny, just a penny will do. Give me a penny, on the boat I'll carry you. The sing-song voice made him uncomfortable, but he had to move forward. He had to keep going. A penny? His mind contemplated what this meant and what demon was tormenting the little girl. Be our protection against the wickedness and the snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all evil spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Amen. Lifting his rosary, he performed a signum crucis over his chest as he kissed the beads. Using his mouth, he opened the bottle of holy water and sprinkled it slowly over where the girl's heart would be. Stay with me, Katie. He spoke only to the human spirit, not the dark one. Row, row, row your boat. She whistled and sang the lyrics off and on, amusement across her features as Father Monroe looked down, annoyed. You will leave this child of God, unclean spirit. Tell me your name. You have no power here. The girl let out a roar of laughter. I will eat your spirit, priest. You will roam the world with me in your bosom, and there's nothing. But Father Monroe didn't let it continue. With his eyes open and frontward facing, he continued his prayers. Come to the assistance of men whom God has created in his likeness and whom he has redeemed at a great price from the tyranny of the devil. The Holy Church venerates you as her guardian and protector. To you, the Lord has entrusted the souls of the redeemed to be led into heaven. This time, the girl convulsed with a thick white foam coming from her mouth. No, no, no. Father Monroe climbed off the girl and put her on her side. The moment he gripped her face to clear her mouth, she was thrown backward into a table. The lamp from the surface fell in a loud crash onto the floor, shattering into pieces that were launched into the air toward Cameron. You have a darkness in you, priest. You mustn't ignore the call. Knock, knock. Answer me. Katie's body stood up, but as she moved forward, her toes dragged across the floor. 3 loud banging sounds at the door could be heard. Let me taste you, Cameron. The voice was not Katie's, but that of the spirit inside of her. Just one bite. With the rest of his vial, he splashed water at the girl still moving toward him. Watching in disbelief, Father Monroe witnessed the girl slowly inch into a floating stance right before him. While her toes pointed down, there was at least an inch between the tips of them and the floor. Her legs kicked out and caught him off guard. He was pushed onto the wall on the same side of the room he entered. Katie's face contorted, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. There she was. That was her. With a newfound courage and sense of urgency, Father Monroe pushed on. Pray before the God of peace to crush Satan beneath our feet, that he may no longer retain men captive and do injury to the church. Offer our prayers to the Most High, that without delay they may draw his mercy down upon us. Take hold of the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil and Satan. Bind him and cast him into the bottomless pit, that he may no longer seduce the nations. Leave this child of God. Leave her now. Father Monroe could feel the tension in the air shift. It was thick on his skin like sweat on his brow. You must pay a penance, priest. At the last of the words spoken, Katie's mouth opened slowly. At first, the priest thought she was about to speak. It wasn't until it opened unnaturally wide that he noticed the head of a black snake slithering forward. It squirmed across her cheek and down the side of her neck. No matter how hard he tried to move, he couldn't. He was forced to watch as the snake slid around Katie's arm and dropped to the floor next to where her feet floated off the carpet. In a trance, he watched as the narrow pink tongue slipped between poisonous lips and this venomous viper sped up in his direction. Trying to fight the hold this creature had on him, he couldn't get away from it. Katie's body remained frozen, only now her eyes were closed and color was returning to her cheek. Was this the price? In order to save this child's life, was Cameron to accept this demon as his own? By the time he could pull his gaze down where the snake's head lifted and their eyes met, it looked much larger now. The snake wasted no time and slowly and painfully began forcing its way into his mouth. Gagging, the priest tilted his head back but couldn't move his arms to dislodge the creature from the opening. No prayer came to mind and no faith was left on his tongue. Cameron fell forward, grabbing his throat and choking on the leathery form that wiggled into his digestive tract. The lump in his throat and his belly was gone. Katie fell somewhere on the floor next to him. The commotion drew in her parents, who rushed to her side. The gagging ceased, and Father Monroe rolled into his back. He couldn't catch his breath. His ears were ringing, and his eyes felt as though they were on fire. Everything hurt. Everything felt wrong. The Bible said those who are born again through Christ can never be taken by the enemy. That was what his teacher had told him. So why did this happen? Why Father Monroe? His body was supposed to be protected. Why wasn't he worthy of God's protection? Why wasn't this young girl worthy of God's protection? Sitting up, Cameron stifled a grunt. Neither parent paid the priest any mind at first. A slight taste of guilt sat beneath the surface, as he felt bad for assuming the parents might be lying, abusive pricks. Mr. Mayor came forth eventually, questioning what happened and whether priest was okay. I'm fine. Go get your Bible. Have her recite a passage. So long as she's able to do so, you will know the demon is gone. It wasn't the only way to know, but considering that the beast was now in his own belly, he knew it would no longer torment young Katie Mayer. Father Monroe forced himself to his feet, sliding across the floor in a weakened state. The hand with the rosary wrapped around it burned like a rash. It festered, itchy and irritated. Finding the closest bathroom, Cameron took to the sink. Removing his rosary, there was a deep red outline from where the beating had been. Fear was an afterthought. Exhaustion and hunger consumed him. He did, however, feel rage and disappointment. He felt empty. Rinsing off his face, he glanced at his reflection, only it wasn't his face that looked back. It was the face of a monster. Around his head, Father Monroe could see a tattered, worn cloak. It was a dark brown material, and for a moment he thought he could feel it move against his cheeks. The face inside the hood was a skeletal one, teeth missing from his broken smile, but not all of his flesh had decayed. Fragmented pieces of old muscle and tissue remained. Around his nose and parts of his eye sockets, it clung to bone. His eyes were sunken in, but painted over with a deep crimson watercolor. Something didn't add up at first until Father Monroe remembered the song. It played on repeat in his head now. Row, row, row your boat. The words coming from his own lips, while the face without a mouth simply appeared to grin at him. Charon, the ferryman, the collector of souls to the underworld, he simply smiled and gave Cameron a wink, nestling beneath his skin as the priest gripped the sink and watched the last shred of his humanity fade into nothing. There were no answers here today. Only more questions. The most important being, why was Charon, an ancient psychopomp from another mythos, taking over the body of an 8-year-old little girl? It's weird reading my own thing, but you know what? I'll just say this. I didn't advertise. I don't advertise myself as a writer. I don't advertise like my stuff. Like it's just not something I've done. It's a very, I've written a lot in my life, and I just, it's a very scary thing to put your writing, things that you love, things you're really passionate about, out into the world. And that's true for anybody. It's just that all the other authors have more guts than I do. So this is a story that I was very proud of. It actually has more to it than just that, but I shortened it for the sake of, coherency. And yeah, it's something I'm really proud of. I, just being totally transparent, I had actually submitted this story to quite a few things, and it never got picked up. No one ever liked it enough to want it to be anything. So I was, I'm really proud of it. It's one of my favorite things that I've written so far. Second, maybe to, or tied for first with my, my story that I wrote for Livestock, the horror anthology that I'm working on, or was working on, or am working on with Tasha Reynolds and getting out for everybody. So I say all of that to say I decided to suck it up and read it and acknowledge the fact that one of the coolest things this year was seeing one of my stories in an anthology. Something I had given up on and didn't think would ever happen. So it feels really good to have been chosen to be a part of this anthology alongside so many fantastic authors. Not 1,000% sure I'm worthy, but I will take it as a win. And again, I'm very proud of it. It's one of my favorite things. If you watch my channel and you listen to my conversations, you know that horror, religious topics and horror is something that's very appealing to me. And the best things that I love when we're talking about possession films or stories about possession or religion in general is when there's this back and forth moral dilemma between what's right and wrong based on the faith that these men of God are supposed to have. And so Cameron is a bit of me in that sense. And I really enjoyed writing it. It means a lot to me that it was allowed to be in this anthology. So I wanted to share that. And so I don't have to put where to find the author because you're already here, right? So anyway, that is my story, Soul Eater, from Something Bad Happened, an anthology of horror, collected and edited by Jennifer Bernardini. Thank you guys so much for listening. Hopefully it was entertaining. I don't assume that everyone loves my stuff. I'm very proud of it. I love that story. But hopefully you enjoyed at least hearing me read it. If not, don't tell me that. Just kidding. I welcome all feedback. Unless you're a troll and you can fuck off. But anyway, that's all I have for this one. So hope you guys have a good rest of your Sunday. Enjoy your week coming up. Let's see. This is the episode before Halloween. So have a great Halloween tomorrow. Spooky season for the normal people is almost over, but for us, it's every day. So anyway, thank you guys again so much for listening. Have a great week, great Halloween, and I'll see you in the next one.